Okay, good afternoon. Thank you for coming to the MEFA Institute webinar today, Counseling Families with Unique Circumstances in the Financial Aid Process. My name is Stephanie Wells. I work here at MEFA. I've been at MEFA for over 23 years, helping families through the education enrollment process, doing presentations on financial aid and all sorts of other topics. And I'm going to be your moderator today with our esteemed panel of colleagues from local Massachusetts colleges. And I am going to let them introduce themselves before we get started. So start with you, Kevin.
Hi, welcome. My name is Kevin DeRusti. I'm the Associate Director of Financial Aid here at Salem State University. I've been at Salem State for 20 years. I've been in aid for 25. And prior to getting into financial aid, I was actually one of you guys. I was a guidance counselor at an alternative high school in South Park.
Excellent. Samantha.
Hi, my name is Samantha. I'm an assistant director at Bridgewater State in the financial aid office. I've been at Bridgewater for a little over 2 years, but I've been in financial aid for about 8. I started off as a federal work study student.
Nice. Great. And Rebecca.
Hi, everybody. I'm Rebecca Castley. I'm the Director of Financial Assistance at Boston University. I'm mirroring Stephanie and Kevin about over 20 years working at BU in the financial aid office, and I did start my career in admissions. So I thought I'd come to financial aid, get a little taste, and go back to admissions, but I love financial aid, so I've never left. So thanks for joining us and excited for the presentation today.
Thank you. All right, so a little bit about MEFA. I think most folks that are on this webinar know about MEFA, but we are a quasi-state authority, and we were created in 1982 by some colleges in Massachusetts just to create a loan program back in the day. But since then, we've gone on to create savings programs and loan programs, guidance initiatives for students, families, school counselors, college administrators. And so that's really one of the biggest things we do at MEFA is help with guidance. So here's what we're going to talk about today. We want you to understand how special circumstances work, what is considered a special circumstance in the financial aid process that families might come across. And if they do have one of those circumstances, how do they appeal their financial aid offer? How does that process work? What can they expect? We'll focus on 3 distinct groupings of students and families that tend to hit more road bumps than your average student throughout the process because of their unique circumstances: independent students, undocumented students, and non-traditional parent families. So to lay the landscape just before we hand it over to the panel, it's been a crazy year. This past year was crazy with the FAFSA rollout in 23-24. And I'm sure all of you heard about it. It was all over in the news, and the FAFSA delays. I'm sure you were working with students and had just as rough a year as my friends on the panel. But since then, knock on wood, the rollout has been much smoother this year. The FAFSA was released, and it seems to be working well for most families. We're not hearing a lot of complaints. We hear folks finishing it in 10 minutes or less. And it was released ahead of schedule in November, so that late November. So that's really great. But just know that if there are issues with the FAFSA, families and students and school counselors work with us. We're here to help you at the college level, at MEFA. There's other community-based organizations that can help through the process as well. So we'll share some resources in this presentation, but don't be afraid to ask questions as we go. All right, so I'm going to turn it over to Kevin to kick us off and just help us understand what is professional judgment, what is a financial aid appeal, and then we'll get more into the nitty-gritty about the types of appeals and circumstances.
Sure. So professional judgment, because the FAFSA is basically a snapshot in time of a family's finances and their information and circumstances, sometimes it doesn't fully illustrate their current circumstances, especially since it's using 2-year-old tax data. So because of this, the Department of Education allows financial aid administrators to take into considerations that aren't reflected on the FAFSA. And we'll be going over, the considerations throughout this presentation. But basically, it lets us go in, look at the FAFSA, change some data elements based on your, situation as of the date that we're working on it. That's typically called a special circumstances appeal. Every school does have their own processes for appeals, and again, we'll be going over those as well. We can also use professional judgment to make adjustments to a student's cost of attendance, which would allow for additional financial aid or private loans to be applied. We see that mainly for grad students because, you know, we do a standard housing cost of attendance, and if they have a mortgage, it's likely higher. So we can adjust a student's cost of attendance. Another thing we do, which we will be covering, is a professional judgment for dependency status, for making a dependent student an independent student. And, you know, professional judgment, all financial aid administrators have that capability, but what must be remembered is it usually involves some sort of an appeal process, and 99% of the time requires some sort of documentation from the student or the family.
Excellent. Great. So here's we're going to go into all of these circumstances one by one and throughout the presentation, but income, assets, unreimbursed medical expenses, changes to household expenses and size, those are some of the most common changes that might warrant an appeal. All right, so let's first get into the actual process, and I'm actually just going to turn it over to each of our panelists one by one, just to talk about the process at their school, you know, what kind of documentation they typically require, how you as a school counselor can help in this process, because sometimes you might be the one who can provide some documentation. So I'll start with Rebecca.
Sure. Great. So we have at BU, we do have a form that's an appeal form that can be searched on our website that we ask students to submit when they're submitting an appeal. And I understand it can be stressful and not understanding what do they need, so I think the best place to start is to read the appeal form and just start with a form or emailing the financial aid office at the school. We can read the circumstances as the financial aid counselors in the office, and then we can be back in touch with the student or the family or via the school counselor and explain what kind of documentation could support that appeal. So instead of the student and the parent worrying, oh, do they need this? Do they need that? And spending all of their time circling and trying to collect the correct documentation, I think just starting with, if the school has the appeal form, that's a great way. And sometimes that will guide, or just submitting an email or reaching out to the school first. So I think worrying about the documentation, don't worry, because we'll review the appeal and then we might say, this is what we need. I also think sometimes it's, if it's the unreimbursed medical expenses, totally understand that if something happens today, that's very worrisome, that I expect I'll have bills and I expect this will happen. It's really difficult for us to approve appeals because unreimbursed medical expenses are what we're looking. So you have to actually incur those expenses and then show that they're not reimbursed. So I think just making sure we understand, and I'm totally empathetic with something that happens that feels really stressful for the family, but taking a step back and saying, okay, what does this really mean? How can I document, and how does this impact my ability to finance college? So starting with the appeal form is what I suggest families do.
Great, thank you. And before I turn it over to Samantha, a quick question. When in the process would BU specifically want to hear from a family? Because some schools say, wait till we know, if you're accepted. Some schools want the information earlier. Really, that I found can vary.
Yeah, that's a good question. So we are reviewing the application. So right now, where we are in the admission cycle, we're reviewing applications that students are submitting right now we're looking at early decision, and then we'll move to regular decision. So we require the CSS profile, and there's a box for special circumstances. So if something's in there, I will look at that information. But I always say you can't appeal an award if you don't have an award yet. So the right thing to do is to submit the financial aid applications required by the school by the deadline. wait for the first award, and then that's the opportunity to appeal. At BU, we're really trying to stress planning. And so we would love appeals before the enrollment deposit deadline. So whether that's January 9th for early decision or May 1st, we want the family to have the plan, and we want to help with that plan. But we don't want the decision to be like, okay, we'll send our enrollment deposit, and then the bill is sent out in early July, and that's when, oh gosh, that wasn't enough. That's not the way we want the families to come into financing education. We want an appeal before you submit an enrollment deposit, so that the student and family and everyone is comfortable with their financial aid award.
That's great. Thank you. Okay, Samantha, how do things work at Bridgewater?
Sure. So it's very similar to BU, I would have to say. Typically, it's either the student or an advocate of the student will reach out to our financial aid office. We do set up an appointment and sort of discuss what's going on with the student to sort of tailor to their situation. I've had situations where there is no, let's say, legally binding documents that I can submit. I've had a situation where a student had sort of like a domestic dispute, but they could not report it to authorities because of cultural beliefs. It's just really about trying to help the students out, while also being able to understand that we need some sort of documentation to be able to pass the audit. But yeah, it's definitely sort of guiding the students with each different situation. And then as far as timeline for appealing, again, as Rebecca said, we typically wait until the student has their first initial award. I know sometimes it kind of brings in like a light, like, okay, well, I was not expecting to get, this limited financial aid. My family's income has really changed. And then they sort of are more initiative about reaching out to try to see what they can do about the first award letter that they received and that type of aid that they were offered.
Excellent. Great. Kevin.
I'm going to mirror what my colleagues have said. Basically, we do want students, especially incoming freshmen, we want them to have their initial award letter. The main reason for that is so that paths don't cross, so that they don't get their initial award letter while we're still working on their appeal and go, oh my God, so state's out of reach for me. So we'd like students to have their first award letter out to them before they appeal. If it's not a financial appeal, if it's more of a dependency appeal or a special circumstance like homelessness, then appeal immediately. Even if you just filed your FAFSA and just got accepted to Film State, we will look at you and we'll start that process. But typically, we ask students to wait for their first award letter.
Right. Okay. That's good to know. Good to know. Okay. All right. So we're going to kind of go through some of the different types of changes here. So first, let's talk about, we don't have to talk about every single bullet here. I think it's pretty clear what increases in income and decreases are. Typically, I think I can probably speak for the panel that most of the appeals they get are related to decreases in income, because when folks have an increase, they might not, let you know until they have to fill the FAFSA again. So I'll just go around to each of you, and we can start with you, Samantha, since you're the first box on the top of my screen. Just the type of income type changes that you usually consider.
Sure. So it depends on sometimes if the parents were married and there's been a divorce, custody. It could also be child support paid. We also have, let me see, whether a parent has lost a job, student has lost a job. Those are typically the decreases in income. If they sold a home, that would be probably an increase in income, but yeah, that's typically what I would see at Bridgewater.
Excellent. And Rebecca?
Yeah, so financial aid, we establish your eligibility, like your first year. This is how we do it at BU, and we set your award for 4 years. So I think it was Kevin that said the students that are applying now will fill out the 25-26 FAFSA, and on that it will require the 2023 tax return. So that's the tax 2023. And right now we're, hard to believe, ending 2024, going into 2025. So we know things might have changed. So that's kind of what we're looking for. Also, if 2023 was an outlier, and Stephanie, this is where we might see that higher income. So if you got a capital gain, or you hit the lottery, and that's only on your 2023 tax return, and luck have it, that's what we're basing the award on. That's what we want to know about. Unusual income that won't reoccur, that we can consider taking out. And we really just want to get, okay, what is a typical year look like for your parent income? I was reviewing a student today who was applying early decision, and the student actually, when they were in high school, was able to have a job, and they had a salary of about $15,000. And so the student contribution was about $7,000 and they had written that she was no longer working at this job and she wouldn't be able to. So I was able to use that information and kind of use her 2024 income and make the student contribution much lower. So that's where we look for increases in income, what we might see. Now the decrease is right, it's a job loss, or if something has happened. And I think it's important to know, we know it feels stressful. If I lost a job today and my child was applying, I would be stressed and want to reach out, but we always need the documentation. So right now I would want to see the decrease. It's too early. It wouldn't really impact my 2024 tax return. It's too early, obviously, to use the 2025 tax return. I could get reemployed tomorrow. So I think we understand how the families feel, but we might not be able to react right away to a job loss. So just level setting that. And also sometimes we'll see, oh, early retirement is something. And we really look about non-discretion, why the parent is taking, is considering retiring early, but that's something that we have come across. But we want to know about anything that's different in that base year we're using. This year will be 2023 income.
That's great. That's great. Thank you. And Kevin.
Same thing. I was actually going to comment, the items on the left often lead to the items on the right, because again, we are using 2-year-old data. So if, student's family had any of those things in 2023, their FAFSA or their income for 2024, 2025 is going to look significantly different. At Salem State, if a parent or a wage earner in the family has lost their job, we do request that they wait 4 to 6 weeks before filing an appeal, just so that we know that the dust has settled. We'll know if they're eligible for unemployment benefits. Maybe they got a new position. Did they get a severance package? So, and yes, to, kind of go along with what Rebecca said, it's a very stressful situation. And I know the parents really want to get in there and get it done, but we do need that sort of buffer, 4 to 6 weeks, just for everything to settle down so that we can get a really accurate picture of what's going on.
Excellent. Thank you. Oops. All right. So Samantha's going to lead our discussion. Just start with talking about independent students and what makes a student technically independent for FAFSA purposes. We get these questions all the time at MEFA, and we always have to clarify. So if you want to lead us off here, that'd be great.
Sure. So on the FAFSA application, there'll be questions that will determine whether a student is automatically placed as an independent student. Typically, it's the criteria, which is why a student would need to appeal if they fall in another special circumstance to do that dependency override. Sometimes, depending on what their selection is, there'll be additional documents required to satisfy it. But it might not be all of the criteria. So just for example, in legal guardianship, there might be a document required that the student has to submit to the financial aid office in order to satisfy the requirement and have their award processed. Same with the unaccompanied youth for at risk of homelessness.
Great. Kevin, do you have anything to add here?
So it is, federal guideline. I always have to tell students, because we get this a lot, emancipated minor status is not a valid status in the state of Massachusetts. So we cannot do a dependency override based on an emancipated minor status. Throwing that out there.
Right. And then sometimes I know, students might get in a fight with mom and dad or something like that. And that's always a tricky situation unless there's like abuse or something like that. Or, Rebecca, can you talk real quick? I got this question the other day from a legal guardian. For BU, for federal purposes, if a student is in a legal guardianship and they don't have parents or can't get in touch with the parents, they'll be an independent student for FAFSA. But what about for institutional aid for the profile? How does that work? Do you want legal guardian info, or how would that work?
Right. Yes. So on the CSS profile, it does ask you should report court appointed legal guardians should be reported on the CSS profile. And typically we would use that person's income and assets in our evaluation if the parent wasn't, if the student didn't have a parent that they could put on the financial aid application. So we wouldn't use both the parent and a legal guardian if that, we would only consider using the legal guardian. And each school might have a different way that they evaluate students with legal guardians and decide case by case if we do use that person's information when we assess the student's eligibility. But the instructions on the CSS profile are court appointed legal guardians should be reported.
Okay,
yeah.
great. Good to
And
know.
and I think it's just to stress, these are federal requirements. And so that's definitely not the same standard that the CSS profile uses and what we use for BU financial aid. If the student is married, that they should still put their parent information on the CSS profile. It is a different standard that we would use to waive any parent information for our own BU money, and that's what we use the CSS profile for. I'm sure that Samantha and Kevin and we all hear like, oh, well, I just want to let you know my parents aren't claiming me on their tax return anymore. Like, great news. And I just say like, no, that's a decision that's not at all impactful for filing for financial aid.
Good. That's a really good point.
Awesome. Kevin,
one quick thing that I've got right there.
And then I'll let you take off on this one too.
If you have any risk of homeless, unaccompanied youth in your school right now, the best thing to do is draft up or have your school liaison draft up a letter, make a bunch of copies for those students for when they're applying to colleges. Because if a FAFSA comes through and the student states that they were, they're unaccompanied or documented homeless, we're going to need a copy of that letter. So it kind of cuts down on the process time. So if you are aware of any students in your high school that are graduating that are in that situation, I would prep a letter for them now, make them a bunch of copies, tell them to keep them somewhere safe, just so that when the time comes and they are asked for it, it's a quick turnaround time.
So that is, and that's something you would usually hear from guidance counselors about these independent students. Yeah. And I'll put in a plug for a webinar we'll have in January. We don't have the date finalized yet, but we will have a webinar for school counselors with DCF to get much more in the weeds on how to help foster students and students who are at risk of being homeless and those students. So keep an eye out for that one. Anything else about provisional independent student status that Rebecca or Samantha that you guys want to add here?
Sure. So sometimes a student might be at risk of homelessness and don't have a document from their high school or from a shelter. Sometimes I do meet with those students one-on-one, and a financial aid advisor is able to confirm that the student is at risk of homelessness. So that would definitely be a professional judgment based on that.
Great. Awesome. All right. Do you have anything else, Rebecca, on this one? Or?
No, I think we definitely are open to reviewing the student's unique circumstances. And so I think, like Samantha said, a great place to start is a conversation with the financial aid counselor so that we can hear the situation, and then we might be able to say, oh, can you provide this, or how this is how we can help.
Yeah, definitely start with the school. You can always call MEFA, especially if it's a Massachusetts college. We have contacts at every school. So for students who are in these type of very much more difficult circumstances, the whole community wants to help them out. So get in touch with whoever you need to. We'll all work together to help these students. Okay, undocumented students. So who wants to go first? Just kind of explaining, where we are legally for FAFSA purposes, and then I'll talk maybe Kevin or Samantha, and then we'll get into the institutional aid, how that works on the private side too.
Samantha, do you want to take this one, or do you want me to?
Sure. So
Samantha.
I don't mind. Previously, students that have like an undocumented status or what FAFSA would consider um, non-eligible for FAFSA purposes, they really couldn't complete the application for financial aid. But now the MASFA app has been out, and it's an opportunity for undocumented students to try to receive financial aid. I do believe it was done in two phases. So the first one was to have in-state tuition rates and be eligible for non-need-based aid. And then the second phase is to that MASFA application to be eligible for need-based aid.
Yeah, that's going to be a really good resource for students this year. So just to, well, let's talk first, Rebecca, before I go on to the Mass Aid, because we can get into that with Kevin and Samantha. But on the private college side, because it is treated a little bit different when you're looking at institutional aid, can you just talk about that from the private independent school side?
Sure. So there were unfortunately BU's not among the list yet, that we don't give our own BU funding to undocumented students. To get need-based aid at BU, you have to be an eligible FAFSA filer. But there are a number of schools, private schools, that do offer funding to students that aren't eligible to file the FAFSA. So I think it's there's searches that are available. I know there's lists that that I've seen, but it's school by school specific. So I think the student should research, but right, because BU, we're not one of the schools that does offer need-based aid.
Yeah, there's a small handful of schools nationwide that can afford to do that.
Right. Yeah.
But yeah, so it can be tricky. I think the other good piece of guidance on the admissions side, especially if the student is, a successful academic student, is look at schools that have merit aid, because that typically isn't related to, any status here. Let's talk a little bit more about Massachusetts and our new program. Kevin, do you want to just kind of go through and just talk about the new program in Massachusetts to get in-state rates and filling out that MASFA form?
The Massachusetts Department of Higher Ed released their own version of the FAFSA, and they call it the MASFA, which is very creative of them. Not to be confused with MASFA, which is our State Financial Aid Association. But basically,
call it MASFA with one A at the end.
Exactly. So undocumented students are eligible to log into Mass Aid and complete the MASFA, which is legitimately set up exactly like the FAFSA. The questions are all the same. The details, the only thing missing from that is you can't do the automatic transfer of data. Once that's completed, it gets processed. The individual schools have access to the MASFA website, and OSPA, which is the governing board, I should call them the governing board. They're the ones that are doing all the verification and confirmation of the MASFA application, whereas, colleges, we're all doing the FAFSA verification and documentation for that. The state is actually verifying those files. Once they've gone through that process, the student has, done, sounds like a sentence, has completed at least 3 years of Massachusetts high school. They've earned their diploma. They've completed the eligibility form and affidavit. The affidavit is basically, the student stating that at some point they do intend to apply for citizenship. And they provided any requested documentation. At that point, we are able then to award them state need-based financial aid.
which is really
It's
fantastic.
huge. It is definitely huge.
It's going to make a difference. Excellent.
Mhm.
Samantha, do you want to kind of keep going on with this slide and just some guidance for school counselors when, helping students, undocumented students through the process?
Sure. So definitely important for them to do their research on the schools, see what merit aid is available first. Um, there's definitely offices I'm pretty sure, at every college and university that can help out these students, because I know it can be a scary process, especially if they're first gen. They don't really have much knowledge about what the MASFA is because it is fairly new. So definitely the financial aid office and other departments are there to help the students. Um, and it's very, very important for them to consider themselves even for those merit scholarships.
Yeah, definitely. That can be a good resource. And then we do have a list of resources here that you'll all get when you get the slides. Just some resources that we put together, some blogs, helpful tips to help these students through the process.
Stephanie, can I throw one other piece
Yep.
of information into that? So I'm not plugging Salem State, so I am maybe a little
You
bit.
can, that's okay.
Salem State is partnered with the Dream US, which is a national agency that is partnered with 80 colleges across 20 states. Salem State and UMass Boston are the only two schools in Massachusetts that are partnered with the Dream US. What the Dream US is an agency for undocumented students that will or can and will provide tuition fees up to $33,000 for a bachelor's degree. Students that belong to or that go through the Dream US also have the opportunity to apply for stipends for internship or fellowship, and they also get stipends for books. So that is a program that Salem State just started partnering with a year ago. We have 20 students that are in it now. And one of the other benefits of students belonging to the Dream US is they have a designated liaison at the school who kind of like walks them through the whole process, keeps an eye on them throughout the semester, make sure they're meeting deadlines and stuff like that. And the
That's
website
great.
is thedreamus.org.
thedreamus.org. Okay. I think what I'll do before I send out the slides, I'll add that to this. I think that would be a good resource to add to our website.
Yeah.
And maybe we'll ask you to write a blog about it too. All right, we'll follow up, but we'll make sure we get that website on the slides before we send them to everybody because that's a good resource. Okay, so let's pivot a little bit and just talk a little bit about non-traditional parent families. And I'm gonna let Rebecca kick us off with this topic.
Sure. So the FAFSA asks for a student's biological or adoptive parents, and that includes their parents. So that's who you put on the FAFSA. Also, if those biological or adoptive parents are not married, but they live in the same household, both of those parents are reported on the FAFSA. So that's who goes on the FAFSA. If the student's biological or adoptive parents are not married, if they're divorced, separated, or never married, for the FAFSA, the student asks themselves a question, and it's changed. Last year it changed. Who supports them the most financially? Who provides the most support? That's the parent that goes on the FAFSA application. If that parent is remarried or has another spouse, that other spouse is also reported on the FAFSA. For the CSS profile, the same parent that provides the most support on the FAFSA, that is the parent that is on the CSS profile. But there is also a non-custodial CSS profile. So the other parent would have their own application and provide the information so that way we're getting information from both sets of parents. But if a school is not requiring the CSS profile, only FAFSA, it can be completed by just one parent.
Okay, awesome. And we also have a really good graphic that we created last year when it was getting a little crazy with the new FAFSA, and we're trying to get at least folks to get their FSA ID, even though if they couldn't complete the FAFSA. So we have this whole information on our website, and as a school counselor, you can download these scenarios in English, Spanish, Portuguese, and Chinese. And I'll just open up the English one real quick. So we have 3 scenarios about who needs an FSA ID. So they're dependent, living with biological or adopted parents. That's the most simple one. And then we get into, if the parents are divorced or separated, each scenario, how you answer each question goes to the next answer. And then we have independent students. So if you download these 3 PDFs, it's all one document, very easy to just have on your website or refer to. It can help the information flow with the student.
That's great.
All right. Anything else? Sorry, Kevin and Samantha, about non-traditional families that typical, things where you see folks get stumped or tripped up.
We sometimes see if the parent remarried. We get a lot of questions. Well, my new spouse didn't adopt my son or daughter. Why do you need their information? And bottom line is, it's a federal regulation. We need that documentation, and we get it. You didn't adopt an 18-year-old when you remarried, but you're still part of that household, so we are still going to require that information.
Great. Anything else, Samantha?
Yeah, I think we should be, if parents are considering getting married, they should have to consult with financial aid officers.
I think it's also important to note the residency of the parent. I know some students live in Massachusetts, but their parents are out of state, and that can affect state aid for them.
Oh, that's a good point. That's a good point.
Good.
We get questions regularly all the time at MEFA about recently separated parents and what that means. And it doesn't have to be a legal separation. If the parents are separated, you can put separated on the FAFSA form for FAFSA purposes. So just keep that in mind. It doesn't have to be a legal divorce or a legal separation to list that status. All right, so let's talk a little bit about a few different scenarios. And these are all kind of quick little topics here about changes in assets. I know, Rebecca, do you want to just start us off with ones that you typically see where you're able to approve? Or
Sure. So the family files the FAFSA and, if needed, the CSS profile once, and we award them for the year. That we award them for fall and for spring. That's how we do it at BU. And so we really don't need to hear every time money gets spent from a savings account. That's not how that we want to be involved in hearing about financial updates from the family. So really, we want to hear about unexpected things that are happening that are impacting the plan to pay for college. So I think it's been happening, unfortunately, more and more, like the natural hurricanes and tornadoes and things that absolutely were not on your bingo card when you started planning for college. And that is truly something that is impacting potentially using the assets that were earmarked for the student's education. So big things are what we want to hear about, and definitely non-discretionary. So things that the family doesn't have control of. I sometimes say, like, life happens. And so every time life happens, we can't react in the financial aid office. It has to be something that's large and really impacts the family's ability to pay for college and use the plan that they had. That's what I always like to ask the family. Sometimes they're explaining their circumstances, and I say, like, okay, what was your plan to pay? And if there wasn't a plan and then something happens, well, we have to kind of step back and say, like, how can I help in financial aid? Really, how does that impact what your plan was? So sometimes starting with there, and especially if they say, I was using this account, and then, okay, let's start from there, and how can we consider that? But those are the big big topics that we do want to hear from families, but to be realistic, what we can do in the short term.
Right, and that's the whole purpose of this, right, is to figure out what's big and what's small, what will work and what won't.
Right.
Kevin, Samantha, any additions about, other things that you may have seen here?
We had a situation, I think it was last year, where a family appealed because there was a death in the family and the person that died needed to be sent back to their home country, which was Haiti, and the family wanted to travel with them. And that wasn't more of a let's increase your financial aid, but more that was a cost of attendance increase where we were able to, increase their cost of attendance, which allowed the student or the family to borrow a little additional plus loan so that they could kind of offset the cost that, the direct cost that it cost them to provide the funeral and the air transportation for the whole family too.
Great. Samantha, anything to add here?
Yeah, I actually had a situation where a student's family home had like a natural disaster where their roof just collapsed, completely destroying their home, and they were temporarily displaced. So there was a part of a professional judgment done for that and an income appeal because they used most of the, if not all their savings to try to assist with their finances at that time.
Yep, and that happens. I do have one question that came in. I'll put this, Kevin, if you want to answer it, or Samantha. Just kind of going back one slide, but I want to answer it before we get too far off. Regards to the mass residency from mass state aid, if a dependent student is an in-state resident, but parents are not, which residency is the one that matters for in-state tuition and aid? Is it the residency of the student?
It's initially the resident of the parent, especially for in-state tuition and in-state financial aid. After 2 years of the student, so we have a lot of juniors whose parents who weren't receiving state aid their freshman, sophomore year, but now based on the state's laws, they're eligible for state financial aid. They're still being charged out of state tuition and fees because their parents are not Massachusetts residents, but because they've been in the state for 2 years, the student, they're now eligible to receive state financial aid.
Okay, that clarifies. Thank you. All right, great. So we're kind of getting towards the end where a lot of these are, it gets more smaller and smaller what can be considered. But I know I've heard from some, occasionally you might see a private Catholic college take into account funds for private high school, Catholic high school. I have heard of that, but not every Catholic college is going to do that. But Samantha, do you want to just go through any household expenses that families suddenly have to take on that really can impact their aid that you can consider under professional judgment, or what you can't?
I think at Bridgewater, zoning in, definitely the medical expenses has been something, I think, since COVID that has increased. But what we usually do is take in all the information that they have and try to do a simulation. So we kind of give them a heads up of, this is actually going to make an impact on your financial aid or whether it's not.
Right.
And
good to know.
as far as others, like just for example, like the childcare expenses, we can make a professional judgment for the cost of attendance in case a student needs additional private loan funding to try to help with those expenses.
Great. Rebecca, do you have any that you want to highlight?
Right, I kind of think it's the same as the asset non-discretionary. So if they're in the setting and eligibility, if there is a reason, I think Stephanie, you had mentioned the School of the Blind. If a student needs to attend a sibling of the student needs to attend a private high school for a reason, then we can consider that in increasing the student's eligibility. So I guess the standard is just let us know, and then we can decide if we can include that.
Great, thank you. Okay, if you and Kevin, do you want to? You can talk about that. You can talk about household expenses as well, but do you want to also kick us off about changes in family size?
Sure. So changes in family size, which is interesting because they don't ask family size on the FAFSA anymore. But basically, if the family grows, that's more expenses for the family. Students, the family can appeal based on the birth of a new child, grandparents have moved in. Even, my son who used to live on their own is now moved back into the household and we're providing for them. The flip side of that would be, decrease in family size, which we wouldn't adjust based on the family size, but, a wage earner or a parent or passes away, that's definitely an appealable decision like that. But changes in family size, it used to be very prominent on the FAFSA where it would really impact what was then the EFC, which is now the SAI. I don't think we've actually come across any that we would process because we're not really sure how to process that on the FAFSA that doesn't ask that question. Does that make any sense?
Yep.
But it's always good to ask. Bottom line, if students or parents or you guys have questions, just reach out to the financial aid office. And if we don't know the answer, we'll find it.
What about Rebecca, the FAFSA, it still asks the question, but the formula doesn't take into account additional students in college at the same time.
Yeah.
And that policy's been different. It's not really a unique circumstance, but how would BU handle that?
So the great news
Something
is
that you
this,
consider.
yeah, it's still on the CSS profile. So we do still allow the two in college to impact a student's eligibility. I think the good, like for new students, so the school counselors are working with new students, that, right, the FAFSA has changed and that's no longer a question. I think we had to deal with it with students that were current students at our school. So 1 year, their eligibility for federal aid was based on two in college, and then the next year it wasn't. But thankfully that won't be an issue for new filers. But right, that is not impactful for federal methodology.
Anything to add here, Samantha?
So although at Bridgewater we just use the FAFSA, we actually had students appealing, especially if they were upperclassmen, and they really felt the difference from the financial aid formula. So if there was any difference, for example, like another student, family member, or rather sibling in college, we were able to use sort of like an institutional formula to grant institutional aid, but it was based on an appeal process, indicating that from the student.
Great. So there is a process that can be considered. All right. So with that, let's just talk about I think we've talked about a lot of these already. But Kevin, any here that we haven't talked about with cost of attendance adjustments that would obviously increase their ability for more financial aid, or at some schools, they might not get more aid, but they might have increased capacity to borrow.
Now, those are pretty much the top 6 that we typically receive. The other one that I had mentioned earlier is the housing adjustment, but again, that's typically more so for grad students because they do have a mortgage or their rent is a lot higher. But those 6 are pretty much the standard ones that we come across.
Great. Anything to add here, Rebecca or Samantha, that we haven't covered as far as cost of attendance adjustments?
I think this covers it. It's not as impactful for new students, so students applying, but rate the high cost of living. We're in Boston, and so though we are not, we ask a student to live like a student. So that's we've seen there are very expensive apartments in Boston, and I know I'd love to live in one of them, but that's not. So we sometimes, just because a student is appealing and can even show the amount they're spending, that's not necessarily what we will increase their cost of attendance to include. But for incoming first-year students at BU, we require them all to live on campus, so it's not an issue it's for our returning students.
Great, excellent. All right. So Samantha, if you had anything to add on that, but also if you want to just kind of also talk about what you get requests for, but typically cannot consider.
I was just gonna give an example of when it's not considered.
Good,
So,
we'll start you. You
um,
can start us off.
sure. So I basically help students with study abroad and financial aid. So I know that study abroad can be adjusted in the cost of attendance, but some students want to ask for an appeal for $20,000 of spending money for one semester abroad, and that cannot be considered. Although they might use private loan funding, the purpose of a private loan is for educational purposes. So although they're going to study abroad through Bridgewater, it would not be considered as an adjustment to the cost of attendance at all.
And then Kevin, sometimes I get this question a lot. Do they consider the parent loan debt? That's a good one that comes up a lot.
That does come up a lot. Unfortunately, we cannot consider parents' loan debt as an appealable piece. And again, weddings, definitely not. Funerals, we have made some adjustments based on funerals because funeral isn't a personal choice. Like, it's something that just occurs, it happens, you have no choice over it. Weddings, we do not allow appeals.
Right. Awesome. Okay, so the gaps between need-based aid and what the family can come up with, even after all of these appeals and conversations with financial aid have been exhausted, and maybe the aid has gone up, but it doesn't mean that 100% is going to be met, or that there isn't going to be some sort of gap or amount that the family still has to come up with. We still recommend talking to the financial aid office, talking to student accounts if families are having trouble making the numbers work. But I like to go back to Rebecca's comment about having a plan before they pick a school, before they commit. That's really important for families to think about their current circumstance, go through the appeals process as needed, but to be realistic, is the plan gonna work to cover that gap, whether it be through loans or payment plans or whatnot. Sometimes, we always recommend talk to the financial aid office if the numbers are just so far out of their reach, just to make sure that everything has been considered. But there are plenty of schools in Massachusetts that, the public colleges, community colleges, that can help students start off at a little bit less expensive place, gather some credits, things like that, and then transfer. Not just transfer to a public college like Bridgewater, where my alma mater, or Salem State, but there are private colleges all over the state that work, with their local community colleges, and they might have programs. So it's always worth it to just look at all the options, because sometimes the student's dream school might not be affordable for that family, and we have to be realistic when helping them. So just, we do have one question in there, excuse me, that we can answer as well, but we'll give you these slides if you want to register for other MEFA Institute webinars that are coming up, and then you can also scan this other QR code that takes you all the resources for families that you can list on your website. You'll have our social channels, of course. And then as school counselors, feel free to call MEFA, email us if you have questions. We get questions from school counselors all the time who have students in their office that they're trying to help. And if we can't give you the answer right then, we will, email Rebecca, Kevin, and Samantha and say, how do you guys handle this situation? What would you do? So we can help you get to the answers and point you in the right direction if you're not sure. So with that, I think somebody answered the question for me. Thank you, Kevin. I don't see any other questions. So if you have one, just type it in real quick before we end the webinar. But I do want to thank our panelists, Samantha, Kevin, Rebecca, taking your time out of, early decision deadlines that you're trying to process, and financial aid applications are now coming in the door. And it's also holiday season, which tends to be a little bit busier than usual. So we appreciate you taking the time. So thank you so much. And then remember, folks, I'll email you a copy of the slides and the recording to everybody who registered. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Thanks again to our panel, and have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.